All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. I'm Jim Underdown, Executive Director at the Center for Inquiry West in Los Angeles, and the chair of the Center for Inquiry Investigations Group. And I'm really excited for today's guest because boy, is he on our team. He's going to talk about delusions and conspiracy theories and all sorts of different things. But this is right square in our bailiwick of investigating things that just plainly aren't true. So let's get to it. Oh, by the way, we will have a question and answer period after a like about a 45-minute presentation. So go to the Q&A tab on at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions, and we'll filter and try to get a few of those good ones toward the end of the presentation. So um, we're here going to be mostly talking about this book, but our guest today is Joe Pierre. He is a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. So he's a psychiatrist, an author, a speaker, and a forensic consultant who's written over 100 papers, abstracts, and book chapters related to schizophrenia, delusions, delusion-like beliefs, and a host of other topics. His recent book is called False: How Mistrust, Misinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. So please welcome Joe. Thanks for being here today.
All right, thank you. Let me share screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Well, thanks for having me talk this evening, and good evening to all of you. As was mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist. My clinical work through the years has really focused on the treatment of people with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. But my academic work has been focused really on what I call the gray area between psychopathology and normality. And in today's world, I would argue that there's no more timely and relevant example of this gray area than the belief in things that aren't true. Now, what's going on with my slide advancer? There we go. So in my work as a psychiatrist, I've worked pretty much on a daily basis with people who have delusions. Delusions are these false beliefs that are held with unassailable conviction. Common examples would be believing that somebody is the second coming of Christ, or that the FBI has implanted something in their brain to track them. And in psychiatry, when we think about why people have those kind of beliefs, we often just say, well, it's because they have a psychotic disorder or because they have schizophrenia. Likewise, when we talk about cognitive distortions, which are also these sort of forms of false beliefs that often happen in people with depression, we often say, well, those are happening because the person is depressed. But I think, as is increasingly obvious these days, demonstrably false and imminently consequential beliefs that are held with unwarranted conviction are in no way limited to those with mental illness. Now, psychologists don't restrict themselves to psychopathology, and they try to understand the wider swath of human behavior. But even among psychologists, there has not been a lot of emphasis on the phenomenon of false beliefs. And so that was really the motivation for me to write this book, to explain, to sort of teach myself and explain to others why it is that normal people like you and me, people who don't have mental illness, come to believe things that aren't true, and how that can really create problems and wreak havoc in our lives, in our relationships, in our interactions with other people, as well as in national and global politics, as you'll hear me talk about today. Now, one thing I do try to make clear in the book is that we all believe things that aren't true, whether that's self-deception aimed at avoiding distress, or false memories, or contradictory religious ideas about what happens when we die, or just getting the facts wrong from time to time. And so I think it would be fair to say that only the most arrogant among us would ever claim that we're never wrong and we're always right. And yet we do hear people saying that. I would also acknowledge that there are many areas of inquiry where the facts are elusive or unknown or even legitimately debatable. That's not going to be the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today, and it's not really the focus of my book. I'm not going to be talking about why people believe in God or angels or ghosts or the paranormal, which of course is often a topic of skeptics. My focus tonight and in the book is really on what some people have called alternative facts, which I would say are false beliefs despite the truth being known with reasonable certitude. And my focus is also on false beliefs that matter. They're imminently consequential because of their negative effects. So let me start by giving you a couple examples of what kinds of false beliefs I'm talking about. The earth is flat. Vaccines cause autism. Climate change is a hoax. The 2020 presidential election was rigged. The Holocaust never happened. Germs don't cause disease, etc. Now, in short, then, what I'll be talking about and what I'm increasingly concerned about is similar to what Carl Sagan foretold back in 1995. And I suspect that many people in the audience who identify as skeptics are very familiar with this quotation from his book, The Demon Haunted World. So I won't read it. But basically what he foretold is what we're seeing now, that we're living in a time where false beliefs are running rampant in our country and around the world. They're influencing election outcomes. They're being used to justify the replacement of democracy with autocracy, and they are likely to contribute to mass casualties and loss of human life going forward. So with that stage set, when we understand what kind of beliefs I'm going to talk about, we can now move on to answering this question. Why is it that we believe things that aren't true? And why do we often hold on to those beliefs with such tenacity, despite counter evidence or counter opinion to the contrary? Now, another thing that I make pretty clear in the book is that for most of us, we don't believe things that aren't true because we're delusional. Despite what's often claimed, it's not true that our false beliefs or those of our ideological opposites are due to mental illness. We're not suffering from mass delusion or mass psychosis, despite what is claimed. And I can assure you as a psychiatrist that that's not what's happening here. I will also hope to convince you that that these kinds of false beliefs are not simply due to stupidity or anti-intellectualism or lack of critical thinking or idiocracy. While those kind of explanations are common, I feel that they're too easy. They misplace blame onto individuals at the expense of the bigger picture and at the expense of being able to look at potential solutions. So now it is true that there are a multitude of cognitive processes that can help explain our vulnerability to false belief. And in the book, I take the reader through various psychological phenomenon, including some of the things listed here: cognitive biases, heuristics, logical fallacies, and then specific examples like confirmation bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect, cognitive dissonance, the illusory truth effect, and even something called bullshit receptivity. And all of these, I think, can indeed help us understand why false belief is so pervasive and tenacious. At the same time, I can't emphasize enough that these cognitive quirks, as I like to call them, are 100% normal in the sense that they are quirks that we all have. They're vulnerabilities that we all have, albeit to various degrees. And they aren't just the psychological foibles of our ideological opposites, no matter how often they're framed that way. They're foibles that we all share. And so while some of those factors can be helpful at explaining false beliefs on an individual level, I argue for a simpler, a more universal, a less pathological, and a really more humanizing framework to understand false belief that I call the 3M model, based on 3 core components: The first is mistrust, the second is misinformation, and the third is motivated reasoning. So let me try to explain the model, and I'll start with mistrust. When I talk about mistrust, I'm really talking about something that philosophers and psychologists called epistemic mistrust, or mistrust of information or knowledge. And when I use that term, I'm specifically referring to mistrust in mainstream sources of information, institutions of authority, as well as scientific expertise. And I think the data are fairly clear that we are currently living in an era of significant mistrust. According to polling data, at least from the US, that kind of mistrust is broad and pervasive. So for example, if we look back to the 1970s, 12% fewer people say that most people, generally speaking, can be trusted. And that might not seem like a huge shift, 12%, but you can see from the graph that the move from just under about half of respondents who said that they could trust most people to about a third has been a steady decline over the past several decades. A coincident but much steeper decline has been found for trust in the media, which in this survey referred to newspapers, TV, and radio. So according to this Gallup poll given over the past 5 decades, trust in media has decreased significantly since the 1970s, so that whereas about 70% of US adults had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media back then, only about 30% have that kind of trust now. And the rest say that they either don't have very much trust or no trust at all in the media. And meanwhile, if we look at Pew poll data, trust in government has likewise taken a nosedive so that it is now at historic lows. Only about 20% of US adults currently trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. According to the General Social Survey, trust in science and scientists has actually held more steady through the years. So that's good news. But the bad news is that there is evidence of a significant decline in trust of scientists in recent years, coincident with the pandemic. While most people do still trust scientists at least a fair amount, the proportion of respondents that have a great deal of confidence in scientists has fallen from about 40% down to only about a quarter of US adults since the start of the pandemic. Meanwhile, another quarter says that they have no, let me go back for a second. Meanwhile, another quarter says that they have not too much or no confidence at all that scientists act in the best interests of the public. And about half of the sample believe that scientists should stay out of policy debates. Poll data from 2019 found that just under half of respondents believe that scientists are just as biased as everyone else. And about 35% said that the scientific method can be used to produce any conclusion the researcher wants. Now, due to this growing epistemic mistrust, some people have claimed or have declared the death of expertise. Now, I want to be clear that I'm certainly not claiming that we should all just blindly follow what we're told. And there's no doubt that there are sometimes that sometimes this kind of mistrust that I'm talking about is earned due to trust violations, scandals, conflicts of interest, corruption. But what I am making the case for is that real expertise ought to count for something, and that when we reject expertise, it often amounts to a kind of blanket denialism rather than evidence-based skepticism. And that, as this well-tread cartoon illustrates, can potentially prove deadly. All right, so that's mistrust. According to my 3M model, when we're mistrustful of epistemic authority, whether it's other people or the government or the media or scientists, we then become vulnerable to misinformation as we go looking for answers. Now, of course, misinformation is not a new phenomenon in any way. It's probably been around since human communication first began, and I would simply define misinformation as information that's not true. And so, if we look at this political cartoon and we swapped out smallpox and substituted COVID-19 or measles, this cartoon might seem very well like it's referring to what's happening today, even though it's from a century ago. Researchers at the Rand Institute have found that throughout history, truth decay, including mistrust of informational sources, the blurring of opinion and fact, and disagreement over what's true, has often followed a proliferation of misinformation ushered in by new forms of media, such as newspapers, the printing press, radio, or TV. Now, over the past 50 years, coincident with deregulation and expansion of cable TV stations, and of course, the boom of the internet, our media landscape has transformed so that we have a myriad amount of information that's accessible to us at a click of a button, with unreliable sources of information that are situated right besides reliable ones, so that it's often difficult and sometimes even impossible for some of us to tell the difference. And so if we look back at the kind of false beliefs that I highlighted at the beginning of this talk, these are not far-fetched contrivances that arise from the minds of single individuals, the way that delusions do among the mentally ill. These are claims that are out there in the world that are adopted and shared by other people. So, thanks to the internet, although certainly not just the fault of the internet, but thanks to the internet, all it takes is just a few clicks to find misinformation claiming that ivermectin really is an effective treatment for COVID-19, that vaccines cause autism, or that the current measles outbreak in Texas is actually caused by the measles vaccine, not by not being vaccinated. And while those might seem like ridiculous claims, that's just the tip of the iceberg. No matter how outlandish a topic, we can always find someone out there claiming it to be true, whether it's that the earth is flat, or that the Holocaust never occurred, or that lizard people have infiltrated the highest levels of government. It's pretty much anything goes. Now, as I said, misinformation is not new, and deliberate disinformation, defined as misinformation that's put out there purposely with the knowledge that it's false, those are not new phenomena. And the disinformation has, for a long time, been a for-profit industry. What I would argue has shifted over the past several decades is that back in the old days, it was relatively easy to recognize misinformation or disinformation because, for one thing, it was confined to the grocery store checkout line. But in the modern era, where we have, again, many different cable TV stations, we have the internet, we just have so many different sources of information, it can, as I said before, be very difficult for people to identify where misinformation is located, because it's located right alongside of more reliable information. And meanwhile, we have so-called influencers who are peddling misinformation, and they have really become celebrity millionaires in the process. To make matters worse, in 2025, it's not just the National Enquirer or Alex Jones that are profiting from disinformation. It's also our governmental leaders. Whether it's the late Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe using a snowball to illustrate that climate change is a hoax, or Donald Trump, before he ever even ran for office, promoting the birther conspiracy theory that President Obama wasn't born in the US. And of course, his unflagging dedication to the big lie that the 2020 election was rigged or stolen, still saying this to this day. Or his more recent claim that Kilmar Abrego Garcia had MS-13 tattooed on his knuckles, which even Fox News refutes. Then there's the fact that the lab leak theory of COVID-19 has now become the official White House narrative. And don't get me started on RFK Jr. RFK Jr. has written in one of his books about rejecting germ theory He's denied specifically that HIV is the cause of AIDS. And now that he's the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, he has falsely claimed on repeated occasions just in the past several weeks that the MMR vaccine contains aborted fetus debris. He's even claimed that chemtrails really do exist and that he's going to do everything in his power to stop them. Now, why is it that we're so susceptible to misinformation and disinformation? Well, one reason is that information scientists have found that within the click-based economy of the internet, misinformation or false or fake news travels farther and faster than reliable news. And sadly, the fact is that false information, misinformation, is really much better at capturing our attention than the boring old sober truth. Furthermore, thanks to the illusory truth effect that I mentioned briefly earlier, the more we're exposed to false information, the easier it is to believe that it's either true or at least that it might be true, which if you're trying to profit from misinformation is really half the battle, to at least raise doubt. And current trends really suggest that things may very well get worse, and quite possibly much worse. Social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, and X have made the profit-based decision to abandon fact-checking while financially incentivizing viral content. And in just the past few weeks, the NSF and several other federal agencies have canceled research grants investigating misinformation and disinformation, so that I would argue it's hard not to conclude that misinformation isn't seen as a bug by the Trump administration, but rather a design feature. Okay, so I've talked about mistrust, and I've argued that mistrust explains why people discount reliable information. And I've argued that misinformation explains where we find counter narratives or where they find us. And so what's left to explain is what's driving this mistrust and why it's just some people that believe in misinformation and others don't, and why both sides of any debate stick to their guns and refuse to budge. And so to understand that, we need to move on to the third M in my model, which is motivated reasoning. So our vulnerability to misinformation has to be understood as an interaction between cognitive processes like confirmation bias, as well as the architecture of the internet. So confirmation bias, I think, has become a sort of household word. I think many of us are familiar with that, but this cartoon offers the best illustration I've ever seen of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias means that we tend to gravitate towards information that supports what we already believe or want to believe, while swiping past or rejecting information that contradicts it. So in the cartoon here, the first panel, there's a guy at his computer screen. He says, "I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the real truth." And he gets on a search engine and he clicks on literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe. And then he says, jackpot. So when we're on the internet in particular, digital forces, whether those are echo chambers or filter bubbles that are steering us to what the algorithms think that we want to see, lead to this sort of process of what I call confirmation bias on steroids. When people say that they're quote unquote doing my own research, they're not really doing research. They're looking to confirm what they already believe or want to believe. And that's very easy to do when we get into online spaces. Now, confirmation bias goes hand in hand with the related process of motivated reasoning. And so confirmation bias refers to what we do when we encounter the information, either deciding to engage or not engage. Motivated reasoning takes that one step further. It refers to what happens when we do actually engage with or praise the information, which is similar to what happens in confirmation bias. We judge information as high quality, reliable data when it supports what we want to believe or already believe, and then we critique or dismiss information as low quality information if it contradicts with our beliefs. And so motivated reasoning explains why conservatives think that Fox News is great, but CNN is fake news, while liberals think exactly the opposite. And motivated reasoning also explains why some people can hold strong beliefs based on the flimsiest evidence or even a lone dissenting opinion. So motivated reasoning is really a kind of rationalization that reduces the unpleasantness of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is this sort of psychological tension that arises when our beliefs butt up against reality. And it allows ourselves to preserve our identities, and more specifically, our ideological identities. And by engaging in that sort of self-deception, we never then have to admit that we're wrong. The Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman has called this an example of identity protective cognition, meaning that it allows us to feel good about ourselves with a sense of imperviousness to any challenges to our ideological worldviews. Okay, so once again, I want to be clear that we all engage in confirmation bias. We all engage in motivated reasoning, at least some degree. If we were all unbiased free thinkers who were objectively looking at the evidence to decide what to believe, then we wouldn't be able to predict someone's beliefs based on their political affiliation. The fact that we often can means that many of us do engage in motivated reasoning to some extent, which often amounts to a kind of ideological groupthink. Still, though, while the vulnerability to false belief is universal, so that we all run the risk of believing misinformation, I would argue that at the present moment in time, the kinds of false beliefs that I'm talking about today, and I'm most concerned about going forward, are best predicted not by demographic factors like age, or gender, or race, or even level of education. Instead, one of the best predictors of these false beliefs is political affiliation. Now, according to my 3M model, motivated reasoning is interrelated with both mistrust and misinformation. They kind of feed into each other. And so if we look at political polarization today, it's not just a matter of disagreement over the issues. There's also good evidence of what has been called affective polarization that has emerged in just the past several decades, where it's not just disagreeing on issues, it's really a distinct sort of antipathy or even hatred of and lack of trust in people who identify with the opposing political party. And as you might expect, if we look at trust in government, or in this case, in this slide, trust in the presidency, as we might expect, trust tends to be higher when one's own political party is in power and lower when it's the other way around. If we then look at those data on trust in the media, the substantial decline that we saw in trust in mass media over the past several decades is really mainly explained by a disproportionate decline in trust among Republicans as well as independents, consistent with this idea, this claim or belief that the mainstream media has a liberal bias. And if we recall that trust in science has actually held steady through the years with some more recent decline, you can see that this also is attributable to a disproportionate decline in trust among Republicans in recent years, and especially during the pandemic, when Republicans have now become 3 times more likely than Democrats, excuse me, to say that they have no confidence that scientists are acting in the best interest of the public. And if we then look at informational sources, at least during the Biden administration, Republicans were much more likely to say that they trusted RFK Jr. or Dr. Oz or even Donald Trump himself to make the right recommendations when it comes to health issues than to trust the likes of the NIH or the CDC or DHHS or even the FDA. And, just let that sink in for a moment. In this poll from January of this year, Republicans trusted President Trump as much as their own doctor to make the right recommendations about health issues. And so if we recognize that political affiliation predicts both epistemic mistrust as well as reliance on or rejection of different informational sources, then I think it's easy to see how motivated reasoning explains why there's a massive partisan divide over who believes that climate change is a major threat. In this poll, About 80% of Democrats said that it was, and compared to only less than a quarter of Republicans. It also explains why, as of 2023, 65% of Republicans believed that the COVID lab leak theory was true, compared to only 35% of Democrats. And why Republicans are 5 times more likely to believe that vaccines cause autism, and 6 times more likely than Democrats to believe that vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases they're designed to prevent. And it should come as no surprise that the 2024 presidential election was decided based on Republican voters being substantially more likely to hold false beliefs about rates of violent crime, illegal immigration, inflation, and the state of the economy. Motivated reasoning also explains why we can be so capricious or even hypocritical based on the whims and conveniences of our political parties. And so prior to the 2024 election, we heard quite a bit from Donald Trump and from Republicans that elections couldn't be trusted, they were rigged. And then as soon as he won the election, we stopped hearing anything about that. In much the same way, Republican voters seem to have suddenly stopped talking about the price of eggs, despite the fact that it is still quite high. And for those of you who remember when President Obama was in office back in 2014, there was this sort of kerfuffle about how he showed up to a press conference wearing a tan suit that resulted in many days, if not weeks, of criticism. So if you keep that in mind, can you imagine what Republicans would have said if Obama hadn't worn black to the Pope's funeral? Could you imagine what they'd say if he had accepted a jumbo jet as a gift from Qatar? Or if his administration had threatened to suspend habeas corpus? The fact that we don't hear anything from the right about these news events can be explained by motivated reasoning. And so that's my 3M model. We believe things that aren't true because we mistrust reliable informational sources. We turn to unreliable misinformational counter-narratives, and we justify all of that by ideologically motivated reasoning. So it looks like I have about 10, 15 minutes left. I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about what, if anything, we can do about this. And the last chapter in my book is titled A Prescription for a Post-Truth World. And so it goes into some detail about what we might be able to do as individuals, what we might be able to do as a society to push back against false beliefs and that are rooted in mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. In that chapter, it also spends a considerable time covering how we might better engage with our ideological opposites while steering clear of endless confrontation and dispute. So, if you ever read my book, you can read more about it there, but I'll try to give a brief synopsis to close tonight's talk. So first, from a individual level, I like to say that there is a mentally healthy way to hold our beliefs, and that is with what I call the Holy Trinity of truth detection. And that is based on, of course, 3 things. The first is intellectual humility, which is simply the ability to accept that we could be wrong. The second is cognitive flexibility, which is accepting that other people might be right and having the willingness to change our minds in the setting of evidence. And the third is analytical thinking, which doesn't mean what people often think it means. It doesn't mean numeracy necessarily. It doesn't mean that you're super smart or anything like that. All analytical thinking really means is the skill or the ability to slow down and consider that when we encounter information, it might be wrong. And that's been shown experimentally that if we approach data or information with that mindset, we're less likely then to automatically assume it's true. We're less likely to share it with other people, etc. So those are some tips about individual intervention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I think those are sort of the similar pillars that are inherent to skepticism, which this audience knows a thing or two about. So let's pivot then and talk a little bit about societal intervention. This could probably be a whole hour talk, but I'll just give the broad brushstrokes. And so following up with my 3M model, I think we have to think about how to develop trust. I think we have to think about how to gain it back when it's been lost. We need to think about earning it, keeping in mind what I said before, that mistrust is not necessarily pathological. Sometimes mistrust is earned. And largely, I think we have to do that through engagement and collaboration. And when I say we, I sometimes give a version of this lecture to healthcare providers, or and also institutions like hospitals or institutions like the CDC. We really need to engage with public to develop trust. If we then pivot to educational efforts, so this is related to motivated reasoning, I think we ought to do a better job of teaching not just science, like teaching kids how to do a chemistry experiment, but really teaching the philosophy of science. Why is science a good way to achieve the truth? Why is doing controlled experiments a good way to find answers to questions? I think we can also promote analytical thinking in school. And I think we really need to promote media literacy, not just among young people in school, but across the entire lifespan. One of the most evidence-based interventions for misinformation is also something called inoculation techniques or pre-bunking, which is in distinction to debunking, right? When we debunk something, we're confronting somebody with a belief and we're trying to get them to scale back that belief or to change their mind. That, as it turns out, is very difficult, often because of motivated reasoning. So pre-bunking or inoculation means you're trying to beat misinformation to the punch. And so you talk to people and you say, you may have heard such and such. Well, here's what you ought to consider if you hear that. Okay, so that's sort of a pre-bunking mindset. And then finally, I think as a society, we really do have to think about how to reduce misinformation, whether that's through content moderation, or if we really believe that there's a free market of information, we have to learn how to be better marketers of the truth, because we're really losing that because misinformation tends to market itself much better. I think we do need to hold media and other people who are putting out misinformation accountable. And I think we have to have liability for the harms that misinformation can cause, like when Alex Jones says that the Sandy Hook tragedy never occurred. Now, you might look at that previous slide and say, well, that sounds like too difficult a task, easier said than done. And you'd probably be right to say that. What we know, however, is that it's not impossible, not by a long shot, because Finland has done it. They have really, out of both the will of the public as well as political leadership, have really revamped education, and again, across the lifespan, teaching people how to spot misinformation, teaching them how to not succumb to false beliefs. And studies have shown that they've had quite a bit of success in doing so. Now, the question then is whether in the US here, there's enough political and public will to take this on. And unfortunately, I would say that at the moment, there's good evidence that American democracy has given way to autocracy and authoritarianism that has weaponized misinformation in a way that we haven't really witnessed before in most of our lifetimes, or many of our lifetimes. And so I just wrote this op-ed piece published the other day. I'm just going to read to you from this as a sort of concluding statement. As with patients suffering from delusions, a healthy democracy cannot flourish if it allows itself to be guided by a pageant of falsehoods. If we continue to ignore facts, objective news reporting, and scientific consensus, we will not survive 4 years of autocracy intent on dismantling government institutions, or the next global pandemic, or another decade of the hottest temperatures ever recorded on the planet. To avoid succumbing to suicide by false belief, we cannot allow ourselves to become complacent or complicit, to accept defeat, or to normalize a post-truth world. America will never be great again if we let that happen. Borrowing from another slogan, we must instead fight for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. And so if we want to achieve that, if we want to achieve truth, justice, and a better tomorrow, it's not enough to promote skepticism. It's not enough to follow my holy trinity of truth detection. I would argue that false beliefs have become politicized. I would argue that false beliefs have become a political weapon, and the only way to fight that is to engage in political activism. Other democracies turned autocracies around the world, Georgia, not the state, but the country, is a case in point, have laid out a blueprint for us to follow, and they've warned us to get active now before it's too late. If we hope to make up some ground fighting misinformation that's used to justify political policies that are foolhardy or downright dangerous, we need to speak up and we need to stand up for the truth. We have to contact our political leaders. We have to protest. Some of us need to run for political office rather than just complaining about who's in power all the time. American democracy might very well be ending thanks to the weaponization of false beliefs, but it will surely end if we don't do anything about it. And that's my talk. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Okay, we do have some questions. Yeah, if you do the stop share, we'll come back up.
Okay.
I think I'm going to start with, it just kind of occurred to me during your talk, how much of our susceptibility to wacky beliefs or wrong information is due to our African savanna built brains.
Yeah, interesting question, sort of from an evolutionary perspective. In the book, I do make a comparison or an analogy between our diet of information and our food diets, right? And it's a very common argument that evolutionarily we weren't prepared to have processed foods and candy bars and, this abundance of high calorie, low nutritional foods out there. And that, of course, has been argued to be an explanation for why we have an obesity epidemic. So indeed, I think you and I agree that we also were not prepared for this sort of inundation of information that's out there in the world. I think originally the idea was kind of like a Wikipedia sort of idea, right? That the more information that we have, that would be a good thing because the truth would sort of rise to the top. And so in the book, I talk about this idea of the free market of opinion. And then my, catchy joke is that it's really a flea market of opinion. Because in a free market, everyone has this equal voice and you can look through and find the best information. But in a flea market, the person who gets the attention is the loudest, most salacious, raucous, and often saying the most outrageous, outlandish things. So I certainly agree that I don't think our brains are, quote unquote, wired to interact with that informational landscape, the kind that we live in now. And I'm often struck by the fact that I don't think, I mean, it's starting to happen. I've seen it happen on some level, but this isn't really something that's taught widely in school or otherwise. How do you navigate? How do you decide what's biased or not? How do you, read something and decide if it's true or not? How do you separate fact from opinion, for that matter? And that's exactly what they're doing in Finland, is they're sort of teaching those basic things. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question. But yes, I think this does have to do with being sort of ill-equipped for the kind of inundation of information that we have at our disposal now.
Yeah. Along those same lines, Carolyn wanted to know what place does fear have in our beliefs? Maybe those are related questions.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one thing that in another version of this talk, I do talk about just normal beliefs in a little bit more detail, which I didn't do tonight. And, I think when we often think about beliefs, we think about it in a all or none phenomenon, right? Like you believe in God or you don't believe in God, or you believe in this or you believe in that. And what we know and certainly recognize in psychiatry and treating people with mental illness is that beliefs are not all or none, right? They're quantifiable. And so there's this idea of what we call cognitive dimensions of belief. One of them would be conviction, right? How strongly do we believe? Another would be preoccupation, like how much time, regardless of what our conviction is, how much time do we spend invested or thinking about this? And the third one, which gets at the answer to the question, is what kind of emotional valence, what kind of connection to emotions do these beliefs have? And so I think that's where fear can come in. One thing I do talk about in the book is this sort of quantifiable spectrum of different stages of belief. I refer to this as the 5 stages of ideological commitment. And one of the things that happens as we become more entrenched in our beliefs and our ideological beliefs is that we have this sort of fusion of identity and belief, right? I define myself based on my belief, right? I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm, whatever, I'm a religious, this or that. And I think one of the things that happens there is that when we then engage in discourse around our beliefs, or if our beliefs are challenged, it then becomes a attack on our very selfhood. And that, I think, is very dangerous. That's why I talk about the Holy Trinity of truth detection, including intellectual humility and cognitive flexibility. I don't think we ought to define ourselves based on our beliefs. And there's this sort of common phrase about we should stand up for our beliefs, which sometimes does make sense. I'll give you that. But I often feel like just as good advice might be to stand down from our beliefs. So anyway, that kind of gets at fear, but I think the role of emotion and belief is very important. And I think certainly there is evidence that even things like conspiracy theories, where a lot of my academic work in recent years has been about conspiracy theories, and there's evidence, for example, that conspiracy theories flourish during times of crisis, right? And during times of crisis is when we're scared, like during this worldwide pandemic that we'd never experienced in our lives before. And the kind of odd thing about conspiracy theories is that there's this idea that even though they're these sort of terrible stories, right, that the world is, we're being conspired against by these evil forces, at least it provides this sort of tidy narrative. And then you can identify the bad guy, right? Like the pandemic. Well, we don't have to worry about the virus. This is all Anthony Fauci's fault, right? So that's where I think fear can come in, particularly where conspiracy theories feed into that fear, but also sort of sell you on this false counter narrative.
You talk in the book about there's a difference between delusions and delusional behavior and delusion-like beliefs, which brings to a few people have asked questions about, religion, because if a lot of people believe Jesus walked on water or, changed water into wine or whatever miracle. But if you were to tell your neighbor that I could walk across my pool, he would think you were a nut. So the idea of walking on water is not inconceivable to people. How do you draw the line between out and out delusions and delusion like beliefs?
Yeah, well, thanks for reading. So it sounds like somebody read that chapter, so I appreciate that. Yeah, so you kind of hit the nail on the head. There's a number of different things that I use as a clinician to separate clinical delusions from what I call delusion-like beliefs, like conspiracy theories, for example. So one of them is what you mentioned. I often say that it would be easy for me to find people who believe that UFOs are flying around the sky and abducting people. It would be easy for me to find people who believe that there will be a Messiah, there will be a second coming of Christ. But if I told you that I was the second coming of Christ, or if I told you that I had been abducted last night and had a probe and all that, it'd probably be a lot harder for me. So I call that self-referentiality. People with clinical delusions have beliefs that are mostly about themselves. There's some exceptions, but it's mostly their beliefs about themselves. And the evidence for that belief is typically some sort of inner subjective experience, right? So I believe that I'm the second coming of Christ because last night I had a dream and God came to me in the dream and he told me, right? So then I can hear that story and go, yeah, that doesn't sound likely that that would happen. But when we talk about delusional like beliefs, like conspiracy theories and some of the things I'm talking about today, the evidence isn't subjective experience. And the thing that we believe when we have those kind of beliefs isn't beliefs about ourselves. They're beliefs about the world. And I refer to this idea of like the tale of two alternate realities, right? The difficulty now when you try to engage in somebody who might have a different belief is they'll say, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I think your informational source is BS, whereas mine, I read this such and such. And that's how people can believe things like that the earth is flat, because they can go and find the quote unquote evidence. And that's why I refer to those little phrases about just asking questions, looking for answers, doing your own research, right? I think like that explains a lot of where we're at today.
If we do some monitoring of misinformation at a societal level, like, Zuckerberg removed his uh, restrictions from Facebook, and they're just not. It's like they don't care what's true or not on there anymore. I'll be interested in reading about what Finland did, because there's an obvious issue of this division between tribes, and then if you want to start censoring something, someone was asking about censorship, or it's going to sound like censorship to people if they're pulling certain information. If there's so many identity beliefs out there, if you start saying, okay, we're going to pull all the bullshit out from anti people who don't believe in climate science, or people who don't believe in the Holocaust or whatever, that's going to sound like we're Democrats, we don't like Republican beliefs. How do you guard against that?
Yeah, I mean it's super tricky. I reference Wikipedia. I often think about Wikipedia. I mean, on the one hand, Wikipedia is not the perfect source of information. I think many people might have had the experience where they look something up on Wikipedia, but it's something that they have some serious knowledge about, and then they'll go, yeah, that's quite not quite right. But overall, I actually think Wikipedia is a pretty good resource. And of course, in a place like Wikipedia, there is quote unquote censorship, right? There is this sort of collaborative process. And if you put something in that's ridiculous, it's going to be taken out. So I like that model. And I think that's a good model. What we've seen, though, of course, is this like fragmentation, right? I mean, in the book, I talk about how, when I was a kid, we had four major news networks. Our family subscribed to a single, paper of the city, which I'm not saying we should go back to that. That's a few limited sources, which is not great, but at least we did have this sort of shared sense of what reality is. And so I think the challenge now is, okay, well, now we have like Twitter, which has turned into X. And Trump got sick of that, so he started his own thing, Truth Social, and then there's or TV, right? The conservatives got fed up with Fox News because they got sued by Dominion, and they started saying that Trump lost the election. So now we've got OANN, and Newsmax. I mean, it's just like we no longer have that shared sense of reality. So if there's perceived censorship, then they just move to this other place and create this other news source. So I mean, what's the solution to that? I don't really know, other than I'll go back to what I said, is that I think we can be better about marketing truth. I think there's ways to tell stories and tell people what reality is that's engaging. And this is like what science communication is all about, right? Like how can we be better communicators to people? So I think there are ways to do that. And ultimately, I think content moderation does have its place. I wouldn't call that censorship per se, but I think, platforms like Twitter or wherever have the right to decide what goes on their page. And I don't think that's free speech infringement per se. So I think there's a place for that. But I also am enough of a sort of free market believer to say that, if we're losing this war, we got to be better at winning it.
Yeah, the scientists tend not to be the best storytellers,
Yeah,
with
exactly.
some exceptions.
Yeah.
I mean, you touched on a little bit of it with this idea of expertise. Um, I have a cousin who, was trying to decide whether or not to take the COVID vaccine, and he wanted to go do his own research. Never been to medical school, doesn't know anything about medicine, but he's going to do his own research, which I'm convinced that he wouldn't know how to judge what was right about any research he came upon. So, I mean, how do we get people to respect expertise again?
Well, I think at the end of the book, I sort of talk about I'm not necessarily optimistic about this, right? Because now we have, I have this idea that like conspiracy theories, I often say involve a rejection of what I referred to earlier. It involve epistemic mistrust and this rejection of the mainstream narratives or the authoritative sources of information. But look, here we are now. I was talking about RFK Jr. Now you could argue that the authoritative source of information is the misinformation, right? And so how do we fight that problem when people now go looking for answers? I don't have a great answer, and that's why there is so much emphasis on politics in my talk. The book doesn't actually get into nearly as much politics, but we really have a very different landscape now than we did back then. I do see something in the chat. I wanted to respond to this question because I
Sure.
think it's a great one. It says, with lack of trust, it's difficult to change people's minds by arguing with them. I feel that building relationships is important. 100%. And I think, as a psychiatrist and when I talk to other mental health professionals, I mean, that's like the basic start of, engaging with people, whether you're doing psychotherapy or whatever. And that's why you have to start by establishing trust. And how do you do that? Like I said, with engagement, with collaboration, or if we're talking about a one-to-one level, you do that by compassionately listening to people and saying, genuinely, oh, that's interesting. You think the earth is flat. Like, tell me about that, with genuine curiosity. So
Hmm.
one of the most frequent questions I've gotten over the past couple of years is like, what do I do when I talk to people who believe, such and such? And what I always initially say is, well, what are you hoping to achieve when you talk to them? And they say, oh, I want to change their minds. And I'm like, well, sorry, like that's not going to cut it, right? You can't start there. So I totally agree with that comment. And yeah, you really have to build trust. You have to build in clinical work, we call this a therapeutic alliance, right? You have to gain the person's trust. You have to show them that you're, not just there to argue or to, tear them down or say that they're stupid or something like that. Otherwise, they're just going to dig their heels in deeper.
Which is along the same lines of Jill had a question. How do we instill and encourage intellectual humility and cognitive flexibility? I mean, it's been a problem on our side, on the science side too, is that people are thought of as being arrogant and know-it-all and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you build a relationship with that?
It's a weird double bind, right? Because there is that perception that scientists are white tower, academics, all of those folks. At the same time, I made reference to teaching philosophy of science, and what I really meant by that is I think one of the things that got us into trouble during the pandemic, with this sort of rising mistrust of scientists and medical health professionals and all that sort of thing is that was a time where we had this global problem, and we didn't know the answers, right? We didn't really know how effective our masks. We didn't really know how well are these vaccines going to work. We didn't really know what was going to happen if you got the virus. And I think most of the people in the audience would agree that the strength of science is this ability to look at a problem and then look at it again and again and collect more data and modify. But I think the public gets very frustrated with that. I mean, even I do from time to time. It's like, wait, should I be taking a daily aspirin or shouldn't I? Should I take a statin or shouldn't I? Should I take hormone replacement? Because like we're changing our minds. And that's perceived as, see, these people don't know what they're talking about. And so that's what I mean by teaching philosophy of science, right? I think skeptics know that's the strength of science, right? That the ability to modify our beliefs with evidence. But I think that's widely misperceived because people want these sort of sure answers, right? The definitive answer. And people who come off and claim to have the definitive answer tend to attract people's attention. So I think we really need to get at that again from an early age to teach why that's important to have cognitive flexibility, to gather data and to think more scientifically, which of course is not an intuitive way that human beings think.
To know that science is a dynamic process, it's self-correcting, you
Yeah.
expect to make mistakes and just keep working at it.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean, what often happens is you take that and then you say, well, then I don't have to believe anything, right? Because then, And who knows what the climate change scientists are going to say. Maybe 10 years from now, right, we're going to be in an ice age again. So I don't have to worry about it. So we have to have this balance of understanding that yes, things change, but that doesn't mean that you ignore it or don't have any faith that what the current prevailing explanation is makes sense.
Okay, let's do one more question here. Pamela, this at the risk of opening up a massive can of worms here. Um, do you see any, can AI help or hurt this whole process?
Oh, that's so funny. I just saw that newspaper headline this morning, and I have not read the article yet, but I'm really intrigued by that, and I'd like to know more about it. I suspect that actually I tend to be sort of down on AI, and particularly at the moment as a source of information. Like doctors now are starting to use something called, I think it's called like Med AI or something like that, which I think, I've experimented with that, and it seems like the quality of information is quite poor. I always say that the AI, things like ChatGPT are only as good as the information that's out there, right? They're not thinking, they're just pulling stuff that's out there online. But I actually do think there's potential for this one, this idea that you could engage with, a robot or an AI in these dialogues that we're pulling evidence from places and presenting it. I actually find that a really intriguing idea, and I think that actually does have some potential.
If you could tell the AI which sources to pull from.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, or who's programming the AI, right?
Yeah,
Are we going to let Elon Musk program the AI? Well, I don't know.
probably not.
Somebody asked where they can buy my book, so I have to answer
Oh yeah,
that.
do the plug.
I mean, it's widely available. You can get it on Amazon, or if you're boycotting Amazon because you don't like Jeff Bezos, you can buy it from the publisher. You can buy it from your local bookstore, and you don't even have to pay money for it. You can go to your library and ask them to stock it. So it's pretty widely available.
The book is called False How Mistrust, I say misinformation and motivated reasoning make us believe things that aren't true. Joe, Pierre, thanks so much for all your work and keep up the good work. Thanks for being on.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Keep an eye on your email for the next Skeptical Inquirer Presents. See you next time.